I've been camping since I was a kid. My dad took me out into the woods before I could even walk properly, and I learned everything from him: how to set up camp, how to track animals, how to tell the weather just by the smell in the air. It was second nature to me. I wasn't one of those weekend warriors who bought all their gear from some overpriced outdoor store and then freaked out when they heard a branch snap at night. I knew the wilderness and I respected it. But the thing about nature is, it doesn't care how much you know. It doesn't care if you're prepared or if you've done everything right. When things go wrong, they go wrong fast. This happened about 8 years ago. I was in my late 20s, still in good shape, still feeling like nothing could touch me. I had a week off work and decided to go on a solo camping trip. Nothing extreme, just a few nights out in the mountains, away from people, away from the noise of life. I packed my gear, double-checked everything, and drove about 4 hours to a spot I had been to once before. It wasn't a marked campground. It was deep in the woods, past where most hikers or weekend campers would go. That's what I liked about it. No people. I parked my truck on an old logging road, hiked about 5 miles in, and found a spot near a small creek. Perfect location. Water nearby, plenty of flat ground for my tent, and surrounded by thick forest. I set up camp just like I always did. Tent secured, firewood gathered, food hung up in a tree away from camp. Everything was normal. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, cooked some food, listened to the sounds of the forest. I slepte fine. The second day, I decided to do some exploring. I had a GPS with me, but I didn't need it. I had my compass and I kept track of landmarks. I hiked up a ridge to get a better view of the area. That's when I saw something strange. Down in the valley, maybe a mile away from my camp, there was an old cabin. I hadn't seen it on any maps. It looked abandoned, roof partially caved in, walls leaning at odd angles. I figured it was an old hunting cabin or maybe something left over from when the area was logged decades ago. I made a mental note to check it out the next day. That night, things felt different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling. The forest was quieter. I didn't hear as many night sounds. No owls, no rustling in the underbrush. It was just still. I told myself I was being paranoid. Sometimes the woods are quiet. It doesn't mean anything. But then, around midnight, I heard something. A snap. Not like a branch falling from a tree. More like a deliberate step. Slow. Heavy. I lay in my tent, listening. My hand was already on my knife. Silence. Then another step. Closer. I controlled my breathing, kept still. The fire had burned down, just glowing embers now, so my camp was mostly dark. I didn't want to grab my flashlight and make myself a target. Another step. Whatever it was moving toward my tent. I've camped enough to know the difference between an animal and a person. Animals move with purpose, sniff around, make noise. This was different. Then nothing. For the next hour, I lay there, every muscle tense, listening. I never heard it walk away. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving strangely. But I still checked around my camp. There were footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, human. The tracks came from the direction of the old cabin. I packed up and left. I hiked fast, barely stopping, retracing my path back to my truck. Every now and then, I checked behind me, but I never saw anything. By the time I reached my truck, my nerves were shot. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and got the hell out of there. I don't know who was out there or why they were watching me, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone. had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: 10 days alone in the woods, completely off the grid, away from everything. No work emails, no ringing phone, no people. Just me, nature, and silence. I had done trips like this before, but never for this long and never this deep into the wilderness. The cabin I found was perfect. It was an old hunting lodge, built in the 1970s by a guy who had long since moved on. A friend of a friend knew the owner and told me I could use it as long as I respected the place. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest dirt road, tucked deep in the forests of northern Montana. No power, no running water, just a roof for walls, a wood stove, and a small well outside for drinking water. I packed carefully. Freeze-dried meals, a sleeping bag, a solar lantern, plenty of firewood, a rifle, a small axe, and enough supplies to last me. I wasn't planning to hunt, but the rifle was for safety. Out here, bears were a real concern, and I wasn't about to take chances. The hike in took most of a day. The trail was barely a trail at all, just an old path used by hunters years ago. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were sore, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The place was just as I expected. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, a heavy wooden door with a rusty padlock. I had the key, and when I stepped inside, the smell of dust, old wood, and damp filled my nose. There was a single cot against one wall, a small wooden table, and shelves with a few rusted cans of food that I wouldn't be touching. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, its black iron surface slick with years of grime. A small window looked out into the trees, but it was so dirty it barely let in any light. I spent the first night settling in, stacking firewood, boiling water from the well, and making a small meal. I sat outside for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The deep woods have a different kind of silence. It's not quiet. It's full of tiny sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite place. A feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shook it off. First night jitters, nothing more. The first few days passed without much trouble. I spent my time hiking, gathering firewood, filtering water, and just enjoying the solitude. At night, I locked the door, made sure my rifle was close, and let the fire die down before sleeping. Then small things started to happen. The first was the footprints. On the fourth morning, I stepped outside and saw them. Fresh tracks in the dirt, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but as I looked closer, my stomach tightened. Barefoot, human, they weren't mine. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. They were small, maybe from a child or a small adult, and they had come right up to the cabin door. I tried to stay logical. Maybe a lost hiker? Maybe someone passing through? But 20 miles into the wilderness? Barefoot? That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle next to my sleeping bag. I barely slept, listening to every sound outside. The next day, I made a perimeter check. I found nothing at first, but then, near the well, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pile of animal bones. Small ones, rabbits, birds, picked clean and stacked neatly in a little tower. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been anything. Fox, a bobcat. Some animals hoard bones, right? But deep down, I knew better. That night, I sat in the dark, rifle in hand, waiting. The fire was low, just embers in the stove, and the cabin was silent except for my own breathing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of wood outside. The porch. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands ached. I waited, barely breathing. Another creak, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn crept through the filthy window. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, the footprints were back. More of them, circling the cabin. I needed to leave. I packed my things fast, shoving everything into my backpack. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder as I stepped outside. The forest was still, the air heavy. I started down the trail, moving fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it about 5 miles before I saw it. A deer carcass hanging from a tree. It was fresh. Blood still dripped from its torn throat, pooling on the ground. It wasn't the kill that scared me. It was the way it had been strung up, its legs tied with vines, its ribs exposed like something had been picking at it. I kept moving, pushing myself harder, sweat pouring down my back despite the cold. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was following me, watching me. I walked until my legs burned, until I couldn't go any farther. The sun was getting low, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to my truck before dark. I needed to find shelter. That's when I saw the other cabin. I hadn't seen it on any map, and it looked even older than the one I had just left. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in moss, and the door was missing. But it was shelter. I stepped inside, rifle ready. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rotting wood. There was an old table, broken chairs, and a fireplace filled with ash. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were words. "Don't sleep." My hands went cold. I backed away, heart pounding. That's when I noticed the footprints. All around me in the dust on the floor, barefoot, dozens of them. I didn't stay. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. The whole way, I felt it, that awful crawling feeling of being watched. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just moved, fast and desperate. When I finally reached my truck, the sun was nearly gone. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. And then, just before I turned the key, I saw it, in the rearview mirror, a figure standing at the tree line, small, hunched, motionless, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore down the road, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I say? I just know I'll never go back. And sometimes, late at night, I still dream of footprints in the dirt. Camping alone was something I did often. It was my way of clearing my head, getting away from work, the city, and people in general. I preferred to go deep into the woods, away from trails and campsites, where I wouldn't run into anyone. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. It wasn't. I started my hike early in the afternoon, following an old logging road into a national forest. It wasn't a marked trail, but I had studied maps beforehand and knew the area was mostly untouched. There were no designated campsites, just miles of dense trees, rolling hills, and small creeks. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No traffic noise, no distant hum of civilization, just the occasional rustling of leaves and chirping birds. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. After about 3 hours, I found a good spot to set up camp. A flat clearing near a narrow stream. I pitched my tent, collected firewood, and started a small fire as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and pine strong. It was peaceful. First, I had a quick meal, then sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The quiet was comforting. I could hear the occasional crack of a branch in the distance, but I told myself it was just animals. Around midnight, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself in. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was almost completely dark. I lay on my back, listening to the sounds of the woods. A steady breeze moved through the trees, making the branches creak. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. They were distant at first, just slow, careful movements through the brush. Not an animal too heavy, too deliberate. I held my breath and listened. The steps came closer, then stopped. Silence. I stayed still, heart pounding. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was just hearing things. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep much after that. I woke early, feeling exhausted but relieved. The sun was rising, light filtering through the trees. Everything looked normal until I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my tent. Barefoot. I stood there staring at them. They were fresh. From last night. I scanned the woods, suddenly feeling very exposed. The trees were still, the forest empty. No sign of anyone. I told myself it was probably a lost hiker. Someone passing through. Maybe they saw my tent and got curious. But it didn't sit right with me. I packed up my gear faster than usual, shoving everything into my backpack. I wasn't going to stay another night. I started hiking back the way I came, keeping my knife in my hand, just in case. I was about an hour into my hike when I saw more footprints, fresh, ahead of me, like someone was following the same path I had taken in. I stopped, listening. The forest was silent. Then a branch snapped, not far. I turned and started moving faster. I wasn't running, but I was pushing hard, trying to get back to my truck as quickly as possible. Every few minutes, I checked behind me. Nothing. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The footprints had turned off the trail. Whoever was ahead of me had left the path, disappearing into the trees. I didn't know if that was better or worse. After another 30 minutes of fast hiking, I reached an old structure hidden in the woods. It wasn't on any map I had studied. A small cabin, half collapsed, overgrown with moss and vines. It looked abandoned, but there was a smell, rot, and something else, something metallic. I should have walked away. I should have ignored it and kept moving, but I stepped closer. The door was slightly open. Inside, the air was heavy, damp. Dust floated in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows. Then I saw them. Clothes. Old, dirty clothes piled in the corner. Backpacks, gear, and bones. Small ones, scattered. Not animal bones. Human. I backed out fast, my pulse slamming in my ears. I turned and started moving, walking quickly, then running. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been living in those woods, and they were watching. I didn't stop moving until I reached my truck. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there, breathing hard, my hands shaking. Then, just before I started the engine, I saw it. A figure, standing in the trees, far enough to be hidden, but close enough that I knew they were watching. No shoes, no shirt, just standing there. I turned the key and floored it. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I think about those footprints, and I wonder how many times I've been watched without knowing it. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the mountains. Hiking alone gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. No noise, no distractions, just the sound of my boots on the dirt, the wind in the trees, and the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. This trip was supposed to be no different. A 3-day solo hike through a stretch of remote wilderness, a route I had mapped out weeks in advance. It wasn't a well-known trail, and that was the appeal. No crowded campsites, no people, just me and the land. I parked my truck at the trailhead early in the morning, my pack loaded with everything I'd need: tent, food, water, a map, a compass. The sky was a dull gray, the air cool but not cold. Perfect hiking weather. The first few hours passed easily. The trail climbed steadily, winding through thick pine forests, crossing over small creeks and rocky slopes. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. By midday, I had reached a high ridge with a view that stretched for miles. Rolling hills, dense woods, the peaks of distant mountains. I ate a quick lunch, checked my map, and kept moving. The plan was simple: follow the ridge for a while, then descend into the valley where I'd set up camp for the night. From there, I'd hike deeper into the forest, loop around the base of the mountains, and eventually make my way back. Should have been easy, but sometime in the afternoon, I realized something was wrong. The trail had started to fade. At first, it was subtle. The dirt path narrowing, the grass creeping in. Then it became worse. Fallen branches blocked the way. The ground became uneven, rocks and roots jutting up where they shouldn't have been. I checked my map again, frowning. The trail wasn't supposed to be like this. I pushed on, assuming it was just an overgrown section. Maybe fewer people had hiked this way recently, but the farther I went, the worse it got. Then, all at once, the trail was gone. I stopped, looking around. Nothing but thick trees, endless underbrush. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest. I had been following a clear path just minutes ago. There was no reason for it to just disappear. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had my compass, my map. I could backtrack if I needed to. I turned around. The trail behind me was gone, too. That didn't make sense. I had just come from there. But now it was as if the forest had swallowed it up.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No sign that anyone had passed through. A knot formed in my stomach. I pulled out my compass, the needle spinning slightly before settling. I checked the map again, tracing my route. I had been heading west. If I kept moving in that direction, I'd eventually cross a stream marked on the map. I started walking. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in closer. The ground was rough, sloping downward, forcing me to pick my steps carefully. The silence felt heavier now, as if the woods were listening. Minutes passed, then an hour.
No estream.
No trail, no sign of anything. I stopped, wiping sweat from my forehead. I had been hiking for hours. I should have reached the stream by now. I checked my compass again. The needle was pointing the wrong way. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't possible. I tapped the compass, shook it slightly. The needle wobbled, then settled, still pointing in the wrong direction. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Something was wrong. I had to get out of here. I turned sharply, deciding to head back the way I had come, even if I couldn't see the trail. I'd retrace my steps, find something familiar. But as I moved, nothing looked right. The trees all looked the same. The ground was uneven, sloping in ways that didn't match what I remembered. It felt like I was walking in circles, but I didn't stop. Then I heard it, a sound, a branch snapping. I froze. It had come from behind me. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was silent again. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening. Another sound, a footstep, not mine. My skin crawled. I wasn't alone. I didn't move, didn't breathe. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, deep in the trees, I saw something. A shape, far away, barely visible through the branches. A figure, motionless, watching. A chill ran through me. I turned and started walking, faster this time, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. The forest blurred around me as I moved. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. My legs ached, my throat dry, but I kept going. Minutes passed, an hour. Then I saw something ahead, a structure, a cabin. I hesitated. It was old, weathered. No smoke from a chimney.
No lights.
But it was shelter. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The door was slightly open. Pushed it wider, peering inside. Empty. Dust covered everything. A broken chair, a rusted stove, shelves lined with old, empty cans. And something else. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh. My chest tightened. Someone had been here. Recently. I backed away, stepping off the porch. The woods were silent. Then, in the distance, I saw movement. The figure. Closer now. Still watching. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not when my lungs burned. not when my legs screamed for rest. I just ran. Somehow, I found my way back to the real trail. I didn't question it. I just ran. By the time I reached my truck, it was almost dark. I threw my pack into the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there, breathing hard, staring into the trees. Nothing moved, but I knew I had been followed, and I would never know why. I've camped alone more times than I can count. Some people think it's reckless, but I've always found peace in the solitude. There's something about being deep in the woods, miles from anyone else, that makes the world feel simpler.
No emails.
No traffic, just me, the trees, and the quiet. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had planned for 3 nights out in the wilderness, far from any official campsites. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from trails, near a small creek. It was a perfect place. Plenty of firewood, fresh water, and total isolation. The first day went smoothly. I parked my truck on an old dirt road, hiked about 5 miles into the woods, and found a clearing big enough for my tent. The trees were thick on all sides, but there was just enough space for a fire pit and a decent view of the creek. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and cooked some simple food over the fire as the sun set. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth strong. As darkness settled in, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth soak in. Nights in the woods can be unnerving if you aren't used to them. The silence isn't really silence. It's filled with distant rustling, the occasional snap of a branch, the wind moving through the trees. I've learned to tune it out. Most noises are just animals going about their business. That first night, I slept deeply, the steady sounds of the creek lulling me into unconsciousness. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring, hiking further upstream, fishing a little. The sun filtered through the trees, the scent of damp leaves filled the air, and I felt completely at peace. But as the sun started to dip, something felt different. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. The woods were quieter than before. The usual evening sounds, chirping insects, rustling branches, felt more distant, like they were further away than they should be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. That night, as I sat by the fire, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Nothing was there. I forced myself to relax, but my body wouldn't listen. The hairs on my arms stood up. My stomach felt tight. My instincts were screaming at me, but I had no reason to feel that way. I stayed up later than usual, adding more wood to the fire, keeping it burning longer than I normally would. I told myself it was just a precaution, maybe a subconscious habit from too many nights alone in the wild. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was silent, too silent. I listened, barely breathing. No wind.
No insects.
No running water from the creek. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Leaves crunching, slow, careful. Not an animal. Someone was walking outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps were light, measured, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife I always kept near my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped, right next to me. I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Minutes passed. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. No movement.
No retreating footsteps.
Just silence. I lay there, barely blinking, every muscle locked in place. I don't know how long I stayed like that. It felt like hours. Eventually, The exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, light was seeping through the fabric of my tent. Morning. I sat up slowly, my entire body stiff. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks. Then, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints, circled my tent. They weren't mine. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They came from the trees, moved around my tent, and then nothing. No footprints leading away, like whoever it was had just vanished. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my pulse spike. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know who or what was out there. I never saw them, never heard them leave. But I know one thing, I wasn't alone. I had been planning this trip for months. A full week alone in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no people, just me and the quiet of nature. I had done plenty of solo camping before, but this trip was different. I wanted to go deeper than ever, to a place where I was truly alone. I found the perfect spot after weeks of research. A remote patch of forest, miles from any established trails or campsites. I checked satellite images, scoured maps, made sure there were no roads anywhere nearby. I wanted isolation, and I found it. I packed everything carefully. A durable tent, a warm sleeping bag, a small camp stove, plenty of food and water, a hatchet, a knife, a fire starter. I always carried a GPS and a paper map as backup. I didn't bring a gun, I never had before. The drive took most of the day. I followed a series of winding dirt roads, each one rougher than the last, until I reached the point where the forest took over. From there, I hiked. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles that muffled my steps. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I found my campsite just before dusk. A small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by towering trees. The ground was flat, dry. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and built a small fire as the last light faded. I ate my meal sitting on a fallen log, watching the flames dance. That first night was uneventful. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of an animal moving through the undergrowth. Nothing out of place. I slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over moss-covered rocks, taking in the stillness of the woods. The air smelled fresh, clean. I didn't see any signs of people, no old fire pits, no footprints, no trash. I hiked for hours, eventually looping back toward camp as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. And that's when I saw it. A tree stripped of its bark. The raw wood beneath was carved with deep, uneven cuts. Not from an animal, not from weather. It was deliberate. I stood there, staring at it, feeling the first twinge of unease. I told myself it was old. Maybe someone had been here years ago. Maybe it was nothing. I walked back to camp, shaking off the feeling. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The woods were quieter than before. No wind, no distant animal sounds, just stillness. I went to bed, trying not to let my mind wander. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my campsite. I froze, listening. The steps circled my tent. Then they stopped. I held my breath. The silence stretched. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep because I woke up to daylight. Everything looked normal. The fire had burned down to embers. My gear was undisturbed. But on the edge of my camp, near the trees, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the woods, circled my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. The hike back to my truck felt endless. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. The forest was too quiet. I reached my truck by early afternoon. The door was unlocked. Inside, nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment was open, papers scattered. I started the engine, locked the doors, and drove. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the mirror. At the edge of the trees, someone was standing, watching. I never went back.